Today at the Grove, you are in for a real treat. We have Sarah Thebarge sharing her story with us and sharing a message with you this morning. Sarah is a speaker and she's a writer. She's an author. She's also an expatriate. She's practiced medicine in Africa. Her two books, the first one is titled The Invisible Girls, and then her newest book is titled Well. And her writing is, I've said last service, buttery smooth. You really want to pick up her book. We sold out of the we sold out of The Invisible Girls last hour, but we'll have those in the coffee shop next week, but they'll be in the lobby afterwards. Sarah, I heard her name on college campuses. I get to speak on Christian college campuses around the country, and it seemed like over the last 2 years, every college campus I was on, the students were still talking about Sarah Thebarge, and Sarah's message. And finally, I started to read about her and read her books, and then I knew we had to have Sarah here because Sarah's story, what she's doing with her life, is what we keep saying that God has called you to do as his followers. We keep saying at the Grove that we value lifting up the marginalized, that we want to be a place where all people of all backgrounds are embraced, that we want to go to the most desperate places in the world and make change in the name of Jesus Christ. Sarah doesn't just write about those things. She's living those things. And so I finally got a hold of Sarah and I said, we have to have you here. So Sarah, thank you for coming to the Grove. Can we welcome Sarah this morning with a really louder, great, yes, there we go. We're
That's
glad
amazing.
You're here, Sarah.
Thank you so much. So good to be with you all today. I grew up in the church. My dad is a Baptist minister, and we grew up in the parsonage next to the church. And as a child, I went to so many weddings because my dad officiated all of them. And at all of these weddings, they asked my dad to read this passage of scripture that's 1 Corinthians 13, and it's nicknamed the chapter of love because 9 times in 13 verses, Paul uses the word love. It's where we get these lines that are so beautiful. Love is patient, love is kind. It doesn't envy, it doesn't boast, it's not proud, it's not rude, it's not self-seeking, it forgives, it forgets. And yet, as I listened to this, even as a child, I thought, I'm not sure that the love Paul's talking about is just this romantic marriage love. Mostly because he starts the chapter by saying, if you become a martyr, if you're burned at the stake, if you give all your money up. And maybe for some unfortunate people, that is their experience of marriage. But I think the chapter's about more than that. So it turns out it's true. Because Paul had 4 words for love to choose from in the Greek. So there's phileo, which is friendship love. There's eros, which is romantic love. There's one of my favorites, it's called sorge, which is family love. But the word that Paul uses is agape. Agape, it's the divine love that God has for us. It's the love we read about in 1 John. It says the love that God has lavished on us as his children. It's also the love that Jesus calls us in the Sermon on the Mount to have for our enemies. He says agape them, which means love your enemies with the same unconditional, unrelenting love with which God has loved you. And even though I heard this chapter read so many times and I knew it by heart, for some reason, it never occurred to me to question the last verse in the passage, which says, now these 3 remain, faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love. It never occurred to me to ask why. Why out of 3 really good things is love the greatest? Why out of 3 themes that are woven through the scriptures, faith and hope and love, why is love the greatest? It would take me traveling halfway around the world and nearly losing my life to malaria to find out the answer to that question. A few years ago, I had the opportunity to travel to Togo, West Africa, to practice medicine at a hospital that had just opened there. So I flew to Togo. I flew into the country's only airport, which is in the capital city of Lomé, which is on the coast. And I had to spend the night at a guest house there, waiting for my driver to come pick me up and drive me the 9 hours north to the village where the hospital was. When I got to the guest house, I realized that the staff there spoke no English. They only speak French. And I took French a long time ago in high school, but we had to rely on my knowledge of French to try to communicate. Well, in the first hour that I was there, I managed to make a total fool out of myself. Instead of telling them that their internet wasn't working, I told them that their Wi-Fi was unemployed, and I asked when their Wi-Fi might find a job again. And then the chef asked if I wanted bread with my dinner, and I said, yes, but. So here's the thing. I had read about food safety guidelines before I left for this trip. And in addition to drinking only bottled water and eating only fruits and vegetables you can peel, the guidelines also said that if you get bread from the market, you're supposed to bring it home and bake it again to cook off all the germs that it might have on it. Okay, so when the chef asks me if I want bread with my dinner, I said yes, but, and then I tried to tell him in French everything I just told you all in English, except I lacked really key French vocab words like bake and oven and germs. And so I told him, yes, I would like bread with my dinner, but you have to set my bread on fire. If my bread is not on fire, your bread can make me very sick, and your bread can even kill me. And they looked at me like, who is this crazy American woman who's asking for flaming bread? In the end, we couldn't figure it out, so I said, never mind, no bread. And a few minutes later, he comes out from the kitchen, and he had this beautiful plate of food prepared for me. And I realized that I was really hungry because I hadn't eaten in almost 24 hours. And so I looked at this beautiful plate of food, and what I meant to say was, wow, I'm really hungry, which in French is j'ai faim. But what I said instead was j'ai une femme, which means I sat down, looked at dinner, and exclaimed, wow, I have a wife. Needless to say, when my driver came the next day, these people were super stoked that this crazy lady was leaving. So before we set out on this 9-hour drive, my driver and I decided to sit down and have breakfast together because we didn't know when we were going to have our next meal on this drive. And as we're sitting there over breakfast, he asks me to tell him about my story. So I told him I was in grad school on the East Coast. I got my degree in medicine at Yale, and then I was in journalism school at Columbia. And I had this great plan for my life, which was that I was going to combine these 2 degrees, medicine and journalism, and I was going to be a health reporter for a major newspaper, and I was going to win Pulitzer Prizes traveling all over the world, writing about health issues in developing countries and how we can contribute to solutions. I was so confident that I was going to make a huge impact in the world that when I went for my interview at Yale, the admissions panel asked me, they said, Miss Thebarge, why should we let you into Yale? And I said, because I'm going to change the world someday, and I'm giving you all the chance to say we knew her when. For those of you applying to grad school, I do not recommend that strategy. But honestly, I wasn't being cocky. I meant it. I really meant it because I saw the world was a broken place. It had a lot of opportunities to do a lot of good, and I had a lot of ideas and a lot of passion and compassion and energy, and I really thought God was going to use that to make a big, big difference in the world. And my plan was going really well until halfway through journalism school, all of a sudden, the wheels just fell off that train. I was diagnosed with breast cancer when I was 27 years old. I had a bilateral mastectomy, and the doctor said, we got it all, it will never come back. And I said, well, great, because I've got a plan to get back to you, and cancer was not in my plan. But a year later, my cancer recurred, and this time it was the most aggressive, invasive kind of breast cancer you could get. I had 4 surgeries. I started on chemo. The cancer came back while I was on chemo. So then I had radiation and then went back to chemo. And at the end of that, I ended up in the hospital with a massive infection, less than a 50-50 chance of walking out of the hospital alive. In addition to all of that, the man I'd been dating for 3 years, who had asked my dad if he could marry me right before my first cancer diagnosis, this man broke up with me as I was dying. He said, "Cancer's just too hard." It's like, I know, right? And so when I got out of the hospital, I was so brokenhearted, and the pieces were so shattered of this plan I'd had for my life that instead of staying there and putting them back together, I just decided I was going to bail. And so I sold all my stuff. I sublet my apartment. I got a one-way ticket from the East Coast to Portland, Oregon, because it was as far away as I could get without falling off into the ocean. And I landed in Portland with just a suitcase of clothes and a broken heart. And I stood there in the rain waiting for my friend to come pick me up. And I was just this bald, broken, bruised mess of a girl, wondering, how do you start over after that? And it was shortly after I got to Portland that one afternoon I was riding on the Max, which is the light rail train that goes across town. And I noticed this Somali woman and her 2 little girls get on the train, and the mom and the 4-year-old found seats, but the train was so crowded there wasn't a third seat for the littlest girl. And so she stood up next to her mom, and as we're riding down the tracks, this little girl is standing there, and she's falling asleep, and she'll almost topple over, and then just before she hits the floor, she startles awake, and she pulls herself up, and then she does it again. And part of me was laughing, like I've never seen a kid try to sleep and stand up simultaneously. But part of me was also a little sad. And I thought somebody should hold that little girl because she's so sleepy. Well, the second that I had that thought, this little girl opened her eyes and she looked at me. So I held my arms out like this, and she climbed into my lap and she fell asleep. And at this point, I'm thinking, I need to make eye contact and start talking to this mom so she doesn't think that some strange woman is trying to abduct her child. And so I looked at the mom and I asked her to tell me about their story. So she began to tell me in very broken English that she and her husband came over with their 5 little girls who were under the age of 9. They were refugees from Somalia. They lost their 3 little boys before they could get out. And now she was here. Her husband had abandoned them right after they arrived in the U.S. So she's here by herself with 5 little girls. She doesn't speak the language. She doesn't have any money. She doesn't have a job. She doesn't know a soul. And when she runs out of English vocab to tell me more about the story, she simply begins to cry. And she says, "It's too much. It's too much." And even though at that point I had never been to Africa, I'd never met a refugee, I'm not a social worker, that's not what I do, I recognized the look in that woman's eyes, because that's the look I had in my eyes too when I first got to Portland. When I had the same experience, you almost die, you end up thousands of miles from home with just clothes and a broken heart, wondering, how do you start over after that? And so I had this deep empathy and compassion for her, and I asked her for her contact information. A few days later, I drove to their apartment to check on them and found that their apartment was freezing cold. It was so cold you could see your breath because nobody had told them that they had heat. And then the little girls were on the verge of starving because they didn't have food stamps. Nobody had set them up with that resource. And so the mom didn't have any money, so she took her little girls to parking lots, and she had them fan out and look for change on the ground. And when they couldn't find enough change on the pavement to buy food, the mom had started dumpster diving. So at night, after she put her little girls to bed, she would walk down the block and she would go through the dumpster behind the grocery store. And when I showed up to check on them, these girls were eating moldy bread dipped in ketchup for dinner because that's all that their mom had been able to find in the trash. And again, I'd never been to Africa. This is my first experience with refugees, and I'm not a social worker, but I just thought, I'm a follower of Jesus, and I'm a human being, and I want this family to know that there's at least one person in the U.S. that loves them and that sees what's going on here. And so I just did what came next. So I went back with some groceries, and then I went back with some clothes, These little girls were walking half a mile to school every morning in the pouring rain, and all they had was flip-flops. So I bought them some good shoes and some rain boots. And then my church got involved, and we did this extreme home makeover event where in one day we ascended on their apartment and we set them up with all the furniture and the clothes and the food that they needed to be able to start to thrive in their new life here in America. And even after they had everything that they needed, I realized I just kept going back and back and back, because just as God was using me to help them in their new life here in Portland, God was using them to heal me. At a time in my life when I was lonely and I felt really unlovable, these little girls just loved on me and accepted me, and they called me their sister. I ended up writing a book about them. It's called The Invisible Girls, and all of the proceeds from the book go into a college fund for these 5 little girls. Like Palmer said, we sold out, but the book is on Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com, Audible, your favorite book place. You can get it, or it's going to be available next week in the bookstore. So the book came out, The Invisible Girls, and all the profits went into a college fund for them, and then I had the chance to travel and speak and tell the story. So that morning in Togo, when my driver asked me to tell me my story, that's the story I told him. And when I finished talking, he just nodded. And then he said, yeah, he said, love looks around. I said, it does, doesn't it? Love looks around and sees people who are invisible and marginalized. Love looks around and sees people through the lens of compassion and love and grace. Love looks around. And then my driver said, speaking of looking around, he said, there's only one road from Lomé up to Mongo, where the hospital is, and parts of that road are very desolate, and there are often carjackers that jump out and carjack you. He said, sometimes they just take the car, sometimes they shoot you first, and then they take the car. So speaking of looking around, he said, as we're driving, I'd like you to look around and tell me if you see men with guns. So I thought before this that it was physiologically impossible to go 9 hours without blinking, but I think I did it that day. My eyes were glued looking for guys with guns. Thankfully, we arrived safely at the hospital, and I started working there. My shifts were 27 hours long. I would show up at 7 o'clock in the morning, work all through the day, all through the night, round on patients, and get off at 11 or noon the next day. I saw more people die in 1 week in Togo than I had seen die in 10 years of practicing ER medicine in the States. People were dying of AIDS and tuberculosis and malaria. We had a little 5-month-old baby girl whose mom pierced her ears, and the baby died of tetanus because kids don't have pediatric vaccines there. And so I watched this baby seized to death of tetanus, and there was nothing we could do. I began blogging while I was there, and that turned into the book that's called Well. It's available out here. I would invite you to get a copy, read more about the story, read about the faces and the names and the experiences, the stories under the statistics, what's really happening today in the developing world. After Togo, I was able to practice medicine in the Dominican Republic. I've also been to Kenya, and I just got back from South Sudan. And amongst all of the thousands of patients that I've had the opportunity to care for, there is one little girl whose face I always see, one story that I will never be able to forget. I was working at the hospital one afternoon when a father came running in, carrying his 2-year-old little girl who's having a seizure. We quickly figured out that she had what's called cerebral malaria. So the parasite that causes malaria, often in kids, will travel to their brain. It causes them to seize, it causes them to go into a coma, and it often leads to their death. We admitted this little girl to pediatrics, and we gave her the very best medicine that we had. Every time she had a seizure, she would stop breathing, and the hospital couldn't afford a ventilator, so that meant I had to breathe for her. Her father was the most devoted parent I'd ever seen. He slept underneath her crib, and when she'd have a seizure, he'd hop out, he'd stand behind me, and he'd watch over my shoulder until the seizure stopped and she started breathing on her own again, and he knew that she was okay. And then he'd crawl back under and lay down on the floor again. As the afternoon went on, this little girl got worse and worse and worse until she was seizing almost nonstop. And I spent hours standing by her crib, breathing for her. And I knew that the prognosis wasn't good, but I couldn't stop trying to save her because I couldn't imagine the pain her father would feel if we lost his baby. So I kept going. Finally, at 2:00 in the morning, I checked her pupils and they were uneven, which meant that she was starting to experience brain damage from the lack of oxygen. But I couldn't stop trying, so I kept going. And then it's 3:00 in the morning, and then it's 4, and then it's 5, and then at 6 a.m., finally, I check her pupils again, and they're blown, which meant that this little girl is brain dead, and she's gone. And so I turned and I looked at her father, who had been standing behind me for hours now, and I just shook my head. And the man ran out of the hospital sobbing. I went after him to find out where he'd gone, and I came outside to see that the sun was just starting to come up. And I found this father kneeling in a patch of dirt, praying toward the sun. He's Muslim, so he's bowing towards Mecca, and there are just tears streaming down his face. I left him to be, and I came inside, and I pulled out the little girl's IV, and I took the patches off her chest, and I washed her little body, and I wrapped her in fabric. And when the father came back inside, I handed him the body of this little girl that I hadn't been able to save. And I said, "Je suis désolée," which means I'm so sorry. And her father was an incredibly gracious man. He simply nodded at me and he said, "Thank you. There was love in your eyes. You looked at my little girl with love." And as I watched him walk away with the body of his little girl we couldn't save, walking home to bury her, I thought, I don't think love is enough. I thought that was as hard as Togo was going to get, but it got harder. I ended up getting malaria. I passed out, got carried to the hospital. I was admitted as a patient myself for a few days. When I got out of the hospital, the town ran out of water. So the town is built on a river. There's a big pump at the river that gets the water from the river, sends it to the treatment plant to get treated, and then disperses it through the pumps throughout the village. But that big pump on the river broke one day, and nobody knew how to fix it. So for days, the temperature is over 100 degrees. You turn on the faucet to wash your hands, nothing comes out. You turn on the shower, there's nothing. These people were desperately trying to work the pumps in the village. There's not a single drop of water. They were so desperately thirsty that people started drinking out of cisterns in the village that are decades old, that have visible bacteria and algae and floating carcasses of animals who have drowned in the water. And they drank it anyway because they were that thirsty. And then from drinking such contaminated water, people got sicker and they started dying even faster. And I thought, God, I am done. I'm done. I'm so overwhelmed. I'm so discouraged. I can't think of a single reason to stay and keep going. I'm done. I'm out of any motivation I could possibly have. And so the internet in Mongo was often unemployed. But I decided that when it found a job again, I was going to go online, I was going to change my ticket, I was going to fly home early, and I was just going to call it. Just be done. Because this was just the amount of suffering in one little hospital, in one little village, in one little country that most people have never heard of. And then you multiply that by the billions of people and the millions of broken places all around the world. I thought, what could it possibly matter that I stay, that I try again? What could it possibly matter? What could incentivize me or encourage me to help me stay? And it was about that time there ended up being this big rainstorm and there was nothing to do. And so I was laying on my bed and I listened to a podcast that I downloaded, and it was about the story of Sisyphus. So Sisyphus is a Greek myth. In the myth, he makes the gods really angry, and so they condemn him to an eternal punishment. That he's going to have this rock on his back, he's going to have to carry it up a hill. Just before he gets to the top of the hill, it's going to roll back down, and he's going to have to do this over and over and over again. The story gives rise to an adjective that's called Sisyphean. It means something that's totally hopeless or useless or futile. I fell in love with the story. I fell in love with that adjective because Sisyphean was exactly what that hospital was for me. No matter how many shifts I started at the bottom of the hill and did my best to carry patients up, no matter how hard I tried, people kept dying anyway. And then I would go back for my next shift and I would start at the bottom again, and it was over and over and over again. I was so in love with the story because it was such a perfect metaphor for what I was experiencing there in Togo, that when the Wi-Fi did come back online again, instead of changing my ticket, I started digging and doing online research about the story of Sisyphus because I wanted to learn more. So I found that the famous author Albert Camus had actually written an essay about the story. And Camus says that we must think of Sisyphus as the hero of the story, that we must think of him as the victor, not the victim. He goes so far as to say we must even think of Sisyphus as happy. I thought, what in the world? How can that guy be happy? And so I kept digging and kept reading more and more and more until I came across another writer named Stephen Mitchell. Mitchell says we must think of Sisyphus as happy for one reason, and it's this. Because Sisyphus fell in love with the rock. Sisyphus fell in love with that rock, so it was nothing for him to put it on his back and carry it higher. In that moment, I realized Jesus is the ultimate Sisyphus. God, who so loved the world, fell so deeply in love with us that Jesus came, put the world on his back. He carried us up the top of the hill to Calvary, and he loved us so much, he gave his life. If you've ever been to Jerusalem, the Via Dolorosa, the road that leads from the city up to the top of Calvary, is literally an uphill climb. Jesus literally put the cross on his back and walked up the hill. Out of love, Jesus took action and did something about it. That day, I found the answer to my question. Now these three remain: faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love. Why? Well, because if Sisyphus only had faith, he would have been praying for God to suspend the law of gravity so that the rock wasn't heavy or it didn't roll downhill. If Sisyphus only had hope, he would have been mentally checked out, waiting for a time in the future where the situation changed and it wasn't so hard. But it was love. It was love that made Sisyphus fall in love with the rock, put it on his back, and do something about it, carry it higher. That's why of faith, hope, and love, love is the greatest, because love makes us do something about this world that God so loves. And our world today is in desperate need of healing. Globally, every year, 6 million children under age 5 living in the developing world die, mostly of preventable diseases, which means every year we lose as many kids in the developing world as we lost Jews in the Holocaust. And the biggest travesty is that it doesn't have to happen. The world needs people who do something about it to get those kids medicine and food and water. We also have a huge refugee crisis. There are more displaced people today than there ever have been in the history of the world. The world needs people to do something about immigrants, to love on refugees. People who even though they've come to the U.S. and we think they're safe, they can still be in an apartment in our neighborhood, freezing and starving to death. The world needs neighbors who check on them. And then in addition to the global issues that we're facing, there are national issues. There are issues in your state, in your town, in your neighborhood, in your family. There are lots of places that need healing. There are lots of opportunities for people who bring positive change. But here's the thing. You will never be able to change the world if you settle for being a person of anything less than love. You will never be able to change the world if you're content to only be a person of faith. Whether you define person of faith by being a person who shows up on Sunday morning and sits here for an hour and believes the right doctrines written on a page, you won't change the world if that's enough for you. You won't change the world if you're a person of faith, meaning you pray for God to miraculously provide food for people who are hungry and clean water for people who are thirsty. You're not going to change the world that way. You're not going to change the world if you settle to be just a person of hope, a person who says, well, in the end, God recreates and renews and restores the world, and we all end up in heaven together, so we're just going to wait out the clock until that happens. You were not here to do that. You were not here to wait out the clock. You are not here to only be a person who hopes for a different outcome in the future. You are here to be a person of love, a person who falls in love with this beautiful but desperately broken place that you're in, enough to do something about it. As followers of Jesus, we are called to be people of love. We are called to be people of the love that looks around, the love that sees invisible, marginalized people, the love that looks through the lens, not of bias and judgment and anger, but of compassion and grace and love. That's what we're called to do because that's what Jesus did for us. As we wrap up this morning, I have two very simple invitations for you. The first invitation, my friends, is that you would experience this agape love that God has for you. That you would experience this unconditional, relentless love that God has lavished on you as his precious child. Because you have to experience and be filled with that love before you have anything to offer anybody else. One of the reasons why I named the book Well and why I love that word so much is because I've seen what happens to people who drink out of cisterns. Cisterns go stagnant and toxic. Cisterns run dry. They run out. But wells are different. Wells have an internal spring that's a constant refilling, a constant renewing. And that's what we're called to be as followers of Jesus, not cisterns that run out and run dry and get stagnant, but wells of living water, which Jesus says he is. And when you are filled with that love, it's going to overflow into the dry, parched places around you. But first, my friends, you have to experience that love yourself. Every day you have to tap into that spring of living water of unconditional, unrelenting love God has for you. And then the second invitation is that after you have experienced that love, that you express it in all the places, in all the ways you can. That you go out and you live love. That you fall in love with the world that God loves, that you let God break your heart for what breaks his, and that you love the world enough to make sacrifices, to do things that are difficult and scary and hard, to do acts of love, and to live out love over and over and over again in all the ways and all the places you can. And as each of us experiences God's love and expresses it in the world around us, we're going to watch as this beautiful but broken place starts to become healed, starts to become whole, starts to become truly, deeply well. Amen.